I'm Alex. I'm co-founder and CEO. And Shane, do
And
you
I'm
want to take it
Shane.
over?
I'll take it over. I'm Shane. I'm co-founder and COO. Alex, would you mind sharing the slides? So while we do that, I just wanted to give some background. Alex and I met in medical school, actually. He was subleasing from my roommate, and I walked in one day and I just saw him in my living room, and we ended up becoming really good friends. We initially started writing papers together. He was initially interested in ortho in medical school, and I was neuro. So we met at the spine, where you have both. And over the span of a couple of years, we published over 30 papers, over 100 abstracts internationally, several patents. So we knew we could work well together. But also, I was in the MD PhD program, and my PhD was at Caltech. And specifically at Caltech, I was working on MEMS technology, bringing in new types of sensors into medicine. And I've always been interested in neuro, like I mentioned. And there were these really interesting sensors that they use in aerospace. And the idea is that it works like a metal detector, and they scan the wings of airplanes to look for cracks. It's called non-destructive testing. So what I thought was, hey, we have these sensors. They've never been used in medicine before. I like the brain. Let me just make a brain model, use these sensors and see what happens. And what I found out was that these sensors are very sensitive to ionic changes. And in the case of stroke, you're really dealing with two different types, one where you are bleeding into the brain, and one when you have a clot and you're literally stopping blood flow. And blood is very ionic. So you can pick up these different ionic gradients in both of these different disease states and recreate images and look at depth. And that's what we'll get into here. So with that said, we're StrokeDx. Very lucky to be working with Alex. Like we mentioned, we work well together. We're really good friends, and we'll jump in from here. So stroke is a huge problem worldwide. It's the second most common cause of death in the world. And in the US specifically, there's 800,000 people per year who have a stroke, and it costs the US healthcare system right now about $150 billion per year. And it's projected to be closer to 300 billion by the end of this decade. And on average, it takes about 2 hours to diagnose a stroke because you have to transport a patient to the hospital, and you require these big, bulky CT machines. And there's no way to monitor with the current care model. And really, the solution that we're focusing on here is using these non-destructive eddy currents to probe different parts of the brain and look at changes in cerebrovascular distribution or blood flow. With the idea being that ischemic tissue is less conductive because it lacks that blood flow, and hemorrhage is more conductive because it has more blood compared to normal brain. And we're picking up electrical conductivity. We could place our coils near the brain, and based off of the target and how much blood is present, we get a different signal back. And we can use that signal that we get back to then calculate how much blood is there. Is it different from normal brain? And if so, how is it different? And briefly just discussing previous approaches in the past, people have tried doing this with EEG, with microwaves, with ultrasound, with accelerometers, the list goes on and on. But really what makes us stand out is we have the cheapest form, it's fully non-invasive, and it answers the two most important questions in stroke, which is where is this lesion located? And is it ischemic, or is it hemorrhagic, or is it normal? And on top of that, we can also impute volume and depth, and all of these different factors really come together to make a really great point of care device.
So let me walk you just briefly through the current path of stroke and where our technology comes in to solve some of these big problems. So currently, let's go through an example where you're sitting across the table from a loved one and it's Thanksgiving dinner, and they start to experience some left-sided weakness. And so you obviously call an ambulance as soon as possible because every minute you're losing 1 million neurons irreversibly. So here's where problem number one comes in. 1 in 6 patients in America go to the wrong hospital in an ambulance. So there's problem number one. Then let's assume they get to the right hospital. It takes a long time, like Shane mentioned, to get you to CT because we do a long list of just general admission checklists as well as a full neuro exam. And in America, on average, it takes 75 minutes from the time you hit the door to the time you get diagnosed with a stroke with a CT. So that's problem number two. Problem number three is, and once you're diagnosed with the stroke, treatment's been initiated, and you're admitted to the floor, all we rely on right now to monitor this disease, which can progress rapidly, is subjective 1 hour, every hour neuro exams conducted by a nurse that's taking care of this patient. So you can see that we have no objective way of monitoring patients at the bedside, and we just rely on subjective exams by staff that has consistent changeover every 12 hours, and it's inherently subjective. So between different staff, you can have different responses. The other thing we do is, since we don't have objective data, clinicians just send patients to CT scans on average per admission 4 times. After the diagnostic one, they go down for 4 scans, which are known as stability scans, that's how we say we know objectively that nothing has changed in the brain, and we have to do it. And each of those scans costs around $2,000. And we'll get into the Medicare bundled payment system in a second, but it eats up over half the payment just from imaging, and 80% of that imaging is unnecessary. So where we come in is in the early hospital and pre-hospital setting. We have a handheld system that you can move around the patient's head, and within about 2 minutes, you can know where the stroke is in their brain, if they're having a stroke, first of all, and what type of stroke it is, to ensure that was 1 out of 6 patients that go to the wrong hospital make it to the right hospital. The second clinical value add, again, in the early stages of stroke, are in the early hospital, where, again, we can use this system. When they hit the ED, you can use it, move it around their head, rule in stroke, get them to CT faster, get them to treatment faster. So that's all with our handheld system. What we raised our seed round of funding on is to build this point of care assessment tool that's used inpatient on the patient's bed. So you can see this here. It's a point of care assessment system that we actually place it right at the head of the bed. The patient lays in it, and within around 2 minutes, you get an image of the brain on the tablet, right? So the big clinical value add here is now you're bringing objective data right to the bedside, getting rid of the need to keep sending patients down for those repeat stability scans, which, again, 80% of the time when they send them for stability scans, they didn't need to go. But clinicians have to send them because these diseases can change rapidly, and we have no objective way of monitoring it. So those are the two big areas that we're focused in. So
just briefly, I just wanted to mention, if anyone's unaware, a CT is also known as a CAT scan or a computed tomography scan. It's those big scanners that you have usually in the emergency department or on the hospital ward. And if you've broken your arm, maybe you've seen a CT scanner before, but it really uses radiation, sort of like a circular X-ray, essentially, to generate an image of a target. So it uses radiation. It's big, it's bulky, it's a few $100,000. It requires an operator. So there's a few disadvantages, as you can imagine, if you're trying to get the fastest care possible in stroke care.
Right, and that's a great point. And also, to get someone down to CT again, the hospital is required to bring 3 personnel to take them from the neurocritical care floor down to CT. And these are critically ill patients that are often ventilated or have a million lines and tubes and drains. So it's incredibly burdensome to the patient and also to the hospital. So we validated this technology through the support of a $2.5 million NIH grant, where we show that we can, in fact, with our first prototype, move the system around a patient's head and diagnose CT. So you can see on the left side, we have ischemic stroke patients. Both of these ischemic stroke patients in the CT images that you see on the far left had a middle cerebral artery. So it's the artery that runs right above the ear. Our system was able to capture, in both cases, the artery that was occluded with our first prototype. Also in hemorrhagic stroke, we were able to identify multiple patients in hemorrhage, but here, this patient actually had 2 separate bleeds in the head, one more superficial, one more in the ventricles. And you can see here, our system was able to pick that up, and our 3D reconstruction lines up very well with CT. And then finally, this 4th patient here had a larger bleed in the back left of the head. We're able to scan it in around 2 minutes and 30 seconds and output this system with our preliminary 3D output, which we've come a long way from. So make sure you stay tuned for us when we going into further studies in the second half of this year. We'll show you the output on the new system. But anyways, this was patented at Caltech. We now hold an exclusive license over that family of intellectual property. And we've subsequently filed a lot more on the utility of it in stroke for us, as well as the designs, which you'll see in a minute. So we had great results with this handheld system, but we were really interested in our first approach to market going for the bedside inpatient system first. Reason being that again, there's a very clear need that these patients are, getting funneled down to getting repeat imaging about 4 times, and hospitals are burning about 60% of their Medicare payment on unnecessary imaging. So this was an avenue that we wanted to target first, and we wanted to build that bedside system to provide the answers that the clinician needed. So we are going to be entering a pivotal study with that wearable system in the middle of August, which I will show you now. So this is the system zoomed in. The way it works is that, again, you place it at the head of the bed. The coil assembly that Shane developed during his PhD project is housed in this red circle you see here. And so there's 2 mechanical arms. There's a green arm that spins the whole coil assembly 360 degrees around the head, and a tan arm, which rotates it to the front to the back. So in about 2 minutes, you are able to get a full scan of the patient's head that's outputted onto a tablet. And the way that we're proposing it will work is that once the patient's gone through the clinical workflow of ED to radiology to get the diagnosis, treatment plan is initiated, they come to the floor. What we're proposing is that they get a baseline scan with our system. So we know what that person's brain looked like the moment they hit the floor. And then at any time and point, or any point in time where you're interested in seeing if there's been any change at all, again, in 2 minutes, roughly 2 minutes, you're able to get an additional scan that our software will compare to the first one and tell you if anything has changed or not. So we're replacing the need for those repeat stability scans, which again, 80% are unnecessary. So I want to show you briefly how our system works. So the patient will be lifted up. There's a bed plate that will be placed at the head of the bed. They'll lay into it. They have a cap that's kind of like a swimmer's cap you can think of to conform their hairstyle and their head shape. They then will have a Velcro strap placed onto their head, so they will be secured to the system. And then the actual system itself is brought in. So everything you see here, including the part that's about to come into frame, everything weighs 6 pounds. So it's incredibly lightweight. It's incredibly low cost. It's non-invasive, and it doesn't use radiation. So you place the system in place, and then you have those 2 arms that I explained, which will rotate the coil assembly around the patient's head. And again, in around 2 minutes, the information will be captured, sent to a tablet where it has our algorithm, which will reconstruct the data and give it to the clinician to make their appropriate decision for what to do next. So Shane, you want to take it over from there?
Yeah. So briefly about our team. Like I mentioned, Alex and I met in medical school. We became best friends from there, still are. And I was in the MD PhD program. I did my PhD at Caltech. And then Alex is now running this company full-time as CEO. And we're very lucky to have him. He's amazing to work with. He's absolutely crushing it. And then we also have my PhD advisor, Dr. Tai, who serves as our scientific advisor. I worked in his MEMS lab over at Caltech, and he has founded many startups out of Caltech and helped advise them moving forward. At the same time, I want to thank our investors. Caltech has been extremely supportive, both from an investment standpoint and as well also from a tech transfer standpoint. We have learned so much from them. They have given us so many resources. We have an office now at Caltech. It's been fantastic working with them, specifically Jay, Julie, and the rest of the EIRs and OTT DP have been fantastic. Freeflow, obviously, thank you for having us today. Thanks for believing in us as we were spinning out of Caltech. And the rest of our advisors and investors, we have Dr. Nursey Sinosian, who's the director of stroke at USC, Dr. Shamsi and Dr. Pat, who are co-founders of RadMD, who design clinical trials for a living, and are also neuroradiologists who invested in us, and Dr. Vikas Pandey, a triple board certified stroke neurologist who also believes in us and invested in us. And our advisors on the regulatory side are Dr. Carlos Pena. He's the ex-director of the FDA for neuro devices. It's been fantastic working with him. Dr. Gabby Zada, he's a director of the Brain Tumor Center at USC and a professor of neurological surgery. And Dr. Selena Kwan, a quantitative economist at Stanford, who actually facilitated some of the Silicon Valley Bank debacle as it was happening. So it's been a fantastic team to work with. And recently, a couple of weeks ago, we got accepted to MedTech Innovator. This year was about 1,900 applications. From that, they selected 61 companies, 40 of which are in the US. And just last week, we were able to compete at the Wilson Sonsini event in the Innovator Summit, and we actually, if we go to the next slide, won first place in the Vision Award. And pretty much the criteria was who would you most likely invest in, and who would you most likely want to work for? And it was an audience vote scenario. So of those 1,900 to 60 to 5 actually got to compete for this, and then we were selected as the one. So we're very lucky. It was a nice little cash infusion, non-dilutive, of course, and it was great to meet all the other companies and compete up there, and to have our tech validated by experts in the field.
Yeah, so thank you all for your time. We're happy to answer any questions you have. I know there's quite a bit of info, but we obviously have a lot more to share. And again, thank you, David and Kevin, for really believing in us from the beginning and sticking through it with us when times were getting tough. And you know, we have, you know, we would not be here without you, and we appreciate your, you know, you pick up the phone when we call, and you answer our emails when we need them, and schedule meetings with us last minute, and let us run by some initially seemingly crazy ideas that are now really paying off. And so I really appreciate the two of you and your mentorship and your belief in us. So I just want to give you guys another shout out there. And again, to the attendees, thank you for coming. And again, happy to answer any questions you may have.
I think there's one question in the chat, actually, which I'm happy to start with before we get into a deeper discussion, if that's okay, Kevin and David.
Yeah, please. Yeah, go for it.
So
maybe just explain,
sure.
Explain.
I'll recap the question.
What Dan's asking as well. And
Sure.
Here, I'll stop the share too.
Stop the share?
Yeah.
Oh, so the question is regarding Dan, who had a family member who had a stroke. Really sorry to hear that, of course, and how this technology could have changed the trajectory, and estimating the benefits of faster treatment and outcomes using a system like this. And I think that's a fantastic question. Specifically, what we're dealing with here is a cohort of patients who are, for the most part, Medicare, above the age of 65, right? And if you're taking a look at efficiency and patient safety within this cohort, really, you're looking at the bundled care system from the money perspective, and from the time perspective, you're looking at having increased efficiency and having better standards within Medicare itself. So what Alex and I are actually doing is, I believe he mentioned this briefly, but we received IRB approval with a non-significant risk device. We do not need IDE exemption from the FDA. We are ready to get started at USC, and we're actually going to do a cost saving and efficiency study at USC with stroke patients to actually give you a real number as to how much time we're saving, how much money we're saving for the hospital system, and how this technology should be implemented to make care more efficient for patients and for providers.
Yeah, and another thing we mentioned too is that, you know, unfortunately in stroke, on an average stroke, every minute you lose 1 million neurons irreversibly, right? And 1 million neurons can be your ability to speak, to walk, to hug your loved one, or unfortunately to live to see another day. So we're still in the process of estimating the clinical benefits, but in terms of minutes saved in, you know, the different cases. Obviously, there are 3 different use cases in the ambulance, in the ED, and in the inpatient unit. But we anticipate saving several, you know, 15 to 30 minutes of time in each situation. Which again, 1 million neurons every minute, that can be a game changer for these patients. And like Shane mentioned, you know, we're in terms of there's a question I see that's about time to FDA approval and going to market. So we met with the FDA a couple weeks ago. We had a really positive call. Again, we have the ex-director of the FDA on our side, so we've had a lot of prep before going to meet with them. So we had that call with the FDA, went super well. We are intending to submit an application for approval around January, early next year, which, you know, if on that timeline, that would allow us to go to market in the second half of 2024. With the inpatient system, with the wearable one that we showed you that video of. And then there's also a question for codes for reimbursement. So in terms of codes, there are a few codes that already exist. We actually just had the ex-director of CMS in California do a complete reimbursement analysis for us. which was very favorable for us in the different situations that we're looking for. But actually, the biggest thing and the most exciting thing, which is what we originally thought, but it was great to get validated by the ex-director of CMS, is there's something known as the Readmission Reduction Act, right? And so with these patients, one of the settings that we're very interested in is the whole continuum of care. So from the inpatient setting, they get discharged to another level of care that's still a neurocritical care unit, but it actually ends the bundled payment system for Medicare. And so what that means is that bundled payment, which is around $17,000 to $20,000, gets applied to what happened before. Now they're discharged and they're in this other neurocritical care unit, also known as like a step down unit. These units do not have any neuroimaging at all, right? And so in Southern California hospitals with the Readmission Reduction Act, with stroke patients in the last 8 years, they've all paid the fee 7 out of 8 years, because they keep getting readmitted because they have no way of imaging these patients' brain at the bedside. So with our technology in that inpatient setting, in the kind of the more of the rehab settings, we can prevent that, right? So we've already spoken to about 50 of these neuro rehab centers, which are on this continuum of care that we've just explained, and they've all expressed extreme interest in working with us, because in that setting, 90 to 95% of the time when they send patients back to the hospital for imaging, 90 to 95% of the time, nothing changed, but they have to send the patients back, right? So for us, there are reimbursements, but really the big angle for us is cost reductions, readmission reductions. We can save thousands of dollars per patient in the current Medicare system.
Yeah, and just giving some background on that as well. If anyone's unfamiliar with the bundled care system, now that we have the Affordable Care Act, the way it works is a disease like stroke, I believe Alex mentioned this, is going to be reimbursed essentially $17,000 to $20,000. So anyone with a stroke, regardless of how severe that stroke is, you're going to get $17,000 to $20,000, right? It's up to the providers and the hospital system to make use with that $17,000 and be efficient, right? Every time you send a patient to a CT scanner, which by the way, for every day that you're there, you need a CT scan on the patient, it costs about $3,000. You can imagine if the average stay of a stroke patient is 3 or 4 days, costing $3,000 each time, that's costing about $12,000 just on imaging. And you're really doing that as a standing check. You're making sure that this stroke is not expanding overnight. The patient is still at the same baseline as before. And really, this is a function of we don't have any other technology to do that, right? And so we have to spend that money. And then Alex alluded to this, once we discharge a patient, we say, hey, we're going to send them to a rehab. Let's get their fine motor skills a little bit better. Oftentimes, they are readmitted back to the hospital, and it dings both systems. Both the neuro rehab is not making money, and the hospital gets penalized, right? So that's why over the last decade, stroke has actually been negative for hospital healthcare systems, just because you have to invest so much money to make sure that nothing is happening from a medical legal perspective, right? And you have to cover yourself. So that's why we really feel like making it more efficient within this bundled care system, which over 75% of the patients who have a stroke are above the age of 65 and fall within Medicare and the bundled care system. We really feel like that is our big selling point, because it's all about efficiency. It's all about time for these hospital healthcare systems and for the patients.
No, thank you for answering those questions and providing that context. One thing I wanted to back up a little bit and just probe a little bit more is you guys were on your chosen paths and then decided to actually launch this company. And I know that you guys have multiple interests too, just medically, if you will, and obviously outside of work too, but in this professional context, I'm curious, why was this kernel that you guys stumbled across, like, why was this the one that you wanted to take and actually turn into a company? Like, what was the driver for that?
Yeah, I can start off. So unfortunately, my grandfather passed from a stroke, and that was a big motivator for me. Also, I love med tech. I love the space. I love. There was a saying that one of my mentors always used to say to me is, Alex, do you want to take care of the forest? Do you want to take care of the tree, or do you want to maintain the forest? And always the concept of maintaining the forest, bringing something that can impact a lot of lives really, it's what I get out of bed for in the morning, right? And so when Shane came to me with this technology, in addition to Shane and I just working super well together, and I don't think we've mentioned this, but we used to be, we did a lot of research together. We started getting noticed by some nonprofits. They started hiring us. We're like, wow, this is great. We work really well together as business partners. And then obviously once his PhD started to gain a lot of traction, and also got the NIH grant and demonstrated how the technology works, it all of those 3 points that I just mentioned really was, it was a no-brainer for me when Shane approached me to join him on this journey.
Yeah, from my perspective, when I joined Caltech to do my PhD, Alex and I were previously, in medicine before that, and we had seen so many stroke patients come and go. And I was always interested in the neuro side. So seeing that this was a big problem, and how, time is brain, and we're spending so much time just because we're limited by the technology we have, I really wanted to work on something that could make stroke care more efficient, make the paradigm better. So when I got to Caltech, I was super excited to look for anything neuro related and how I can apply different sensors to different applications. And this is one that really stood out. So while I was at Caltech, I developed the tech, we patented it there. And then when it came time to spinning out, I couldn't have done this by myself. And Alex was there, and I knew he was interested in med tech, and I knew that he was more than capable of doing a fantastic job. And he's proven me right on all those points. So it's just been a fantastic journey, and the best co-founder I can imagine.
So maybe, David, just a follow-up to that question, to just highlight something that David and I found to be absolutely unique about Shane and Alex, in the context of many companies, many founder teams that we've spoken with. And the fact that they were already thinking about things like reimbursement, and they knew about bundled payments, and they knew about ICD-9 codes and CPT-10 codes, and all the DRGs and all this stuff. Reimbursement in the United States is incredibly complex, and it varies across Medicare, Medicaid, commercial, and so on. And they were already, when we met them, they were already all over it. Typically, when we meet founders, and this is not a criticism, it's just the nature of the business, we ask them, who's going to pay for this? How is this going to get paid for? And sometimes you just get a deer in the headlights blank look, because they're working on the science. They haven't really thought about CMS and about medical billing codes. So these guys were all over that. They were also all over the regulatory approval and the FDA path, and had basically went to school on the med tech industry. And if maybe bring the slide back up with your advisors at some point, they have a who's who of advisors that span not just clinical areas but also economics and FDA. One of their advisors was the first one there, Dr. Pena, director at the FDA for neuro devices. So if you want to talk to somebody to figure out, how do I get this through quickly, what's the fastest but appropriate path for FDA approval, that's there. So they were so ahead of so many things. And so there's a question here, which is, how did you guys, how did you spread out the way you did so effectively and go deep on all these other things that are clearly not just science? FDA approval, maybe it's science, maybe it's an art, who knows? Reimbursement, same thing. But what sort of inspired you to do that? And how did it happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to pinpoint one explanation for it, but I think Shane and I just have a lot of fun together, to be honest. And when there's a lot of white chalk talk, whiteboard talks till 3 a.m., mapping out, studying other companies, studying the competition, seeing why they failed. Honestly, there's a great book called Biodesign that's pretty much the Bible for doing this. We both read that. And we just wanted to build the best team possible. And we wanted to do it as efficiently as possible. And when you're a seed stage company, you don't really have a whole lot of cash, but you do have option pools, and we did have a really exciting story. So we ended up getting all these people that we needed on our side without having to pay a cent for them. It's just been a lot of fun, just writing up on a board, putting, it's almost like we're headhunting who we want, how do we get to them, And we built this team here. And we also now it's the pendulum's kind of swinging, and people that are amazing at what they've done, that would be amazing for us, are starting to reach out to us and like, hey, really cool tech. And you have any room on your board or any room on your, how can I help you? So it's been, there are a few, there's not one way to point it out besides the fact that Shane and I just like hanging out and talking about how we can make our company as great as it can be.
Oh, certainly. When you put Alex and I together, we do get a bit manic, but I think that's a good thing. But I wish I could come to you and say that we were born knowing all this, but that's certainly not the case. I think Alex and I are really good at pivoting and just being resilient and learning quick. If one person says, okay, so what's your regulatory plan? And we, give a, not the best answer, then we say, okay, tonight we're up till 3 a.m. and we're figuring out our regulatory path now. And we're going to email everyone and cold LinkedIn them and ask them to be on our board now. So we just solve problems as they come up, and we just work until they're solved.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is just being young founders. I've experience in medtech. I've been working on a couple orthopedic implants that are now FDA cleared, but just people doubt you when you're young. And I think that's also lit up a major fire in the two of us to bring on the best of the best in whatever we need at our stage, because we're the engine of the machine, but we need the different parts to really keep this thing going. And I think that was another big component of it too.
Oh yeah, 100%. We pitched so many times, and everyone was like, "Oh well, you guys have never done this before. You guys are also in medical school, so you guys might not be the best people to do this." So I think Alex and I know our capabilities. We know how hard we work. So I totally agree that definitely sparked a fire, and we're like, okay, not only are we doing this for ourselves, we're also proving these people wrong. So
yeah,
thank you guys for believing in us.
Yeah, it does. This was just about to say, it's a testament to Freeflow for identifying us, and look where we are now, right? So we just won. We're the CEO of a couple different people, including the CEO of MedTech Innovators, said, "How does it feel to be one of the number one early/mid stage startup in the world right now?" And I was like, "That's a bit extreme, but we'll take that for now."
The people up there with us are the high ups of Johnson & Johnson, Edwards, and a couple other medtech companies, and those are the people standing with us on stage. So it feels really great to be validated in that respect.
Yeah, and a lot more to do still, but we're really happy where we are, and we're also in a unique position too in the neurospace. I'm not sure if everyone's very familiar, but when it comes to non-dilutive, it's ripe with opportunity. And we have 3 grants out right now, totaling around, I think it's like 4.5 or 5 million in non-dilutive opportunity that we're going to hear back over the next 4 months. So we're actively, it's a big part of our time. And fortunately, Shane and I both are. That's where our relationship started, as academic and medical writing and literature, as well as we have our advisors, who are some of the most decorated R01 investigators in the neurospace, who part of their contract is reviewing our grants, critiquing our grants, so we get a first pass through all of them. So we're really hopeful for the upcoming review cycle, and it's just going to be a big part of our company going forward as we continue to expand, because at the end of the day, when you look at what we have, it's a portable neuroimaging system. It's a portable neurodiagnostic that is the lowest cost form of this type of sensor, not on the market, but that soon to be on the market. So there's going to be a ton of additional applications. There'll be a ton of opportunity for grants. So it's a fun space to be in, and it's also it's a fun time to be working with Freeflow and with Shane.
Yeah, that non-dilutive topic is maybe one to dig into a little bit, just for especially for the audience members who, when deep tech, is one of those investment areas that you can actually get non-dilutive funding, and sometimes material amounts. So just curious how you, I don't know, just maybe walk through that, because it can be such a force multiplier, if you can accomplish that. So just maybe walk us through, how do how much might be out there for you? How do you identify them?
Yeah.
How do you make sure they're not impacting your product roadmap in a way that might be a distraction? Mm-hmm. Because if you can find the one that's the best fit. So either way, just some of those things might be interesting to dig into.
Yeah, if you are a seed stage company, it is an absolute no-brainer to apply to the NSF Seed Fund. It's up to $2 million. The first phase is very small. I think it's like 275, but phase 2 is the remainder of the 2 million. It's a no-brainer. It's quick. It's easy. It's not like the NIH where it's like incredibly academically rigorous. It's more like an investor pitch. So anyone that's at the seed stage looking for non-dilutive in the healthcare, not even healthcare, there's so many different avenues, but it's a no-brainer. You got to do that. The other thing is the NIH has a lot of different opportunities dependent on the stage. And one of the most important things, like you mentioned, is not tying yourself to, because this is structured money, right? This is not like, oh, here's $1 million grant. Congratulations, you got $1 million. Now do whatever you want. Yeah. It's not like that at all. So again, going back to the whiteboard, Shane and I would look, you got to look at the deadlines, you got to look at the review cycles, look at the review committee, see when the money would come in, and make sure that your story lines up with your trajectory, right? Because we try to run really fast. And actually, when we did our first cycle of grants, we wrote about something that we would do, but we already had done it by the time that the grant was already reviewed, right? So that was one thing that we learned. Now the 3 grants we have out now the timing works out really well. And then one other final piece of advice is your grant manager is worth every cent. Even before we had any money, Shane and I pooled our savings together to pay for our grant manager, because if you put in something, doesn't matter how incredible your grant is, if it's formatted incorrectly, or that there's some line somewhere for some 2 sentences that has to be in the grant of 180 pages and it's not there, it's out, right? And so when you're trying to run your company and you're trying to navigate the business and your engineering efforts and your clinical efforts, and all the things that it takes to run a medical tech company, you don't have time to do all of those things, right? And so it's not that much, and we have a great resource we're happy to share with anyone, but it's worth every cent. So yeah, that's another Shane. I have more, but I'll let Shane.
No, I totally agree with you. I just find it funny that you said the NSF is the quick and easy one. It's still like 120 pages, guys, but it's not 100.
Well, they weed you out though. All you have to do. There's like a 6-pager that you just say what it is for 6 pages, and then they say yes or no. And if they say yeah, you have to be invited. I should probably clarify.
Yeah, you save about 60 pages.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
but there's a lot of opportunity. So depending on your stage, you can get grants for $500,000. If you're a later stage and then going into clinical trials, you can get them for $10 million. There's obviously a lot of non-dilutive opportunities in the military, which we've met a contact in the military. We actually have an ex Green Beret in the military that runs a lot of the med tech there that we're speaking to now, and going to be getting a grant ready for that. So at NSF, NIH, DoD. Also, a lot of the academies, and a lot of the conferences, like for example, American Heart Association or whatever association or academy that's associated with your technology has a lot of grant opportunities. Although smaller, they're a lot more tailored and a lot quicker. So yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead, David.
Go ahead.
Sure. So you mentioned early on, there are a lot of different use cases. From your comments today, the first sort of area of focus from a go-to-market standpoint will be, hospitals and provider facilities and organizations. What are some of the other areas, beyond in addition to that first area of focus? I apologize if I just want to make sure I answer your question correctly. Yeah. So in addition to the inpatient setting, what are the other areas, later areas? And even if you could elaborate within the hospital, there's a lot of different, there's the ER, there's ICU, there's the, neuro ICU, cardio ICU. So there's a host of other areas. Then you mentioned step down units, EMS. There's a big market out there, which is another thing that was very attractive to us as investors with respect to StrokeDx. So maybe you could just sort of tease those out a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we view it is in the form factor of the technology, right? So the one that sits at the head of the bed is for inpatient, so patients that are laying in a bed in the hospital,
Right.
and for neuro rehab centers, right? So these centers that patients get sent to because the hospital is trying to increase their throughput, but also has it's still very high level care, but they don't have any neuroimaging. So that wearable system fits there, right? And we explained the economic model there. I'm happy to go through it again, but it's going to save them a lot of money. The other area is, again, the handheld system. So the handheld system is for rapid rule-in and identification of stroke to ensure that people go to the right hospital and to make sure they get to CT faster, right? So one of the analogies we like to talk about is in trauma. So let's say you have a patient that just was in a car accident. They're brought into the ED, and they still have this super long checklist because this is America, and you have a ton of things that has to happen before you can get touched by a clinician and have any treatment plan. So in trauma, they use an ultrasound probe. They call it the FAST exam. It stands for Focus Assessment Using Sonography in Trauma. And they take an ultrasound probe, they look in your chest, your abdomen, and your retroperitoneal space while you're getting checked in. And if it's positive, if there's a positive FAST exam, they don't need to see if you have pulses in your toes or if you can feel your fingertips. You're bleeding in your abdomen, right? So they get sent immediately to imaging and they activate the trauma pathway. Nothing exists for the brain because ultrasound doesn't penetrate through bone. Now with this handheld system, we can be that analogy in the neurodegenerative or cerebrovascular disease space, whereas as this patient's getting checked in, they're actively stroking, and our system can tell you that. And again, you don't need to see if they have pulses in their feet. You don't need, there's a whole other slew of checklist things that need to happen. But that doesn't matter. This patient is actively dying in front of you and they have a stroke. So, the EMS, ED are for the handheld system, the inpatient neurocritical care, as well as the neuro rehab are for the bedside system.
Great.
I see there's another question in the chat as well. From Michael, how does the device become recognized as a new standard of care? Is there a process with trade associations? Obviously, it is never an easy feat to change what someone has been doing in the hospital for decades, but there's a couple ways that you can approach this situation. One is having key opinion leaders, people who are known in the field, and taking peer-reviewed data with key opinion leaders and publishing them in high-impact journals. That's how you get the recognition from people, and that's how you initially get your foot in the door. And we're lucky because we're coming from a medical perspective. We've worked with a lot of these people, we've published with them, and that's what we're going to continue doing as we get this data. We know how to write papers, we know how to publish, and that's what we're probably best at, and that's what we're going to do in real time. And then once you have that out there, the next step is showing how you make the standard of care better, right? So if you're saying, hey, if I'm saving 30 minutes and that is functionally the ability to feel your fingers or the functional ability to move your fingers, right? Then associations like, the AANS, American Association of Neurological Surgeons, or the Association of Neurologists, the stroke neurologists, are going to start adopting these as their standard of care and enforcing them to make sure that you're providing the best standard of care to your patients. And then the third level is from a more greedy hospital incentive of, hey, if I have to spend less resources on these patients, they're getting better outcomes, I'm going to implement this sooner, right? So I can save money on the back end, right? So it's sort of like a three-pronged approach, and luckily, being in the medical space, we have that experience.
That's exactly right. It's really just making sure that you develop a very, very specific cost saving study that in a sense, it identifies those three things that Shane just said, that it improves patient outcomes, it saves the hospital's money, and it is better than the current standard of care, right? And then those three things, it does take time, but when you start to publish this data, let's say you take an institution and you show that compared to the way that they currently do things, you improve it in those three areas, it's almost like they have to adopt it because it looks bad if they don't. So identifying those partnerships, and also the way that you structure the study in terms of the contract, in terms of publication rights, is another way that you can kind of implement and force feed them into adoption. because they have to show that the current way that they're doing things is not as good had they used your system, right? So that's what I was saying, really being specific, and making sure that your clinical trial agreement or clinical study agreement forces them to display the data in a way that shows those 3 benefits. Because sometimes hospitals won't want to show it, right? Because it's like, oh man, like this is not as good as, or we're not doing things as well as we should. But if you structure it in such a way, you can enable your story to be out there sooner.
Alex, there's another question as well if you want to tackle it.
When do you expect commercial release of the products? It's at the end of in the second half of next year is what we're anticipating. So we met with the FDA. We went through all of our plans with them, got it all cleared, and so now we're just in the phase of preparing that application, which we anticipate sending in early next year. 510K pathways can take anywhere from 90 days to 120 days. So we're looking for approval in the middle of next year. And then launching the commercial products. And on a soft launch, we're not anticipating going for like a huge release, more of a controlled release in the latter half of 24.
Yeah, and just to comment on that, to the extent that you can elaborate, that from our perspective, David's and mine, as investors, and perhaps the person who anonymously asked that question, that is lightning fast. In terms of any benchmark or any kind of reference point or industry standard. We were just flabbergasted to find out how far along they already were with the FDA, and having identified, key opinion leaders, and then bringing somebody onto their advisory board that could provide very relevant, very useful and tactical information on how to thread the needle. And that's what that process is. And they were really so far along. I don't know if you guys care or can or want to elaborate, but that was just another box that you checked in a very positive and forceful way.
I think what a lot of people don't realize is you can literally submit pre-submissions to the FDA and say, I want to do a 510K. What do you want from me so you approve this as fast as possible, right? And that's what we've been doing for free. So we did that. We talked to them. We got their feedback. We're going to do a second one before we fully dive deep into our 510K pivotal study. So really having that dialogue with the FDA and saying, what do you want to see? What do you want from us? And we'll do whatever you want. Just make our lives easy. Is a good approach that I don't think a lot of people take.
Yeah, a lot of companies are afraid of the FDA, and this program it's so helpful. Even just the process of going through and generating this pre-submission document was immensely helpful for us. And then asking our specific questions, even thinking of what those specific questions were, getting their response, and then having to craft a document that we present. Because the way the pre-sub works, for those who don't know, is you generate a document that explains a lot, all your plans, how the tech works, and then you have to give specific questions. Then the FDA answers those specific questions in written format, and then within 15 days, you can schedule an in-person or a Zoom meeting where you have to present slides, you have to address specific points, you have to take your meeting minutes, you have to write the minutes and then send it back to the FDA. And then they give their comments if there's anything that they are unsure of. And those minutes have action items or decisions made, right? And then that's set in stone, right? So from a de-risking perspective and an evaluation perspective, we now know what they're okay with and what they're not and what we need to tailor. And then we're going to do a second pre-submission to fully finalize everything. And again, it's completely free. So, definitely encourage people to do it, not be afraid of it, but also there are ways that you need to ask your questions in a very specific way, or else they can, if you're too broad, they can tell you to do a million things. But if you're very specific with your questions, it doesn't really give them room to tell you to do things that people are worried about, like, oh, you have to enroll 1,000 patients now or something crazy like that. I think that's what people's fear are.
Yeah, there's another question about go-to-market strategy, reaching the clients directly through distribution channels. So we've had some productive conversations with various strategics who have been very interested in serving as a distribution channel and helping us along our path. But I think Alex and I are still trying to decide the best path to move forward, specifically in the US. Definitely internationally, we will use, distributing partners. But within the US itself, we're weighing a couple of these big strategics versus doing it ourselves. So stay tuned for that answer. And then reaching clients, like we mentioned, we have the key opinion leaders, we have people who are well known in stroke neurology and experts who have published in JAMA and New England Journal multiple times. And really, it's a tight-knit community. Once you show efficacy, cost savings, saving neurons, making outcomes better, you gain traction quickly, especially when you know the people. So that's really our plan.
Yeah, we're big believers in publications and demonstrating the success of the data in a peer-reviewed format. It's something that a lot of companies, I don't think, take advantage enough of getting those published data showing that your technology works, and how it works and how well it works, and then using the platforms of submitting it as an abstract, going to that conference where there's an audience of all the people that you could potentially sell it to, and you are presenting as an academic, right? You're presenting it as showing this is the data from a peer-reviewed format. This is how good it is, right? Not instead of from just a purely sales perspective of trying to send someone a pamphlet of information about how great your document or how great your technology is, but actually getting in front of them in their own environment where they are learning about the new greatest things, but getting accepted as a more on the academic side rather than on a purely business side as an exhibitor, for example.
Right. So maybe one other thing you could elaborate on is you mentioned, Shane, I believe that, if you're admitted with, some kind of traumatic brain damage, you're getting a CAT scan every day. So that's not, just expensive, but you tell us, but it's probably not that useful in terms of a longitudinal, picture of somebody's neurological or cardiovascular health, which is a very dynamic thing that changes 1 minute to the next. So maybe you could talk about, not just the utility, but the frequency of use and the value that might afford from a clinical outcome standpoint.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I think in this space, we're extremely limited by technology. Obviously, we have things like MRI, which don't use radiation, but both MRI and CT are cross-sectional and they're expensive and they require someone to sit in the machine all day long. And they require another team to transport people to the machine all day long. And a hospital usually, if they even have one, has one or two, right? So the resources here, the cost here, the efficiency here is limited. And the reason that we scheduled the follow-up as we do is we have no other tools to say, hey, okay, now it's tomorrow. What has changed in this guy's brain? Yesterday his right arm was a little stronger than it is now. What could it be, right? And from a medical legal standpoint, you also have to cover yourself, right? So that's why they schedule, Q6 every 6 hours or Q24 every 24-hour stability scans in these stroke and traumatic brain injury patients and post-operative neurosurgery patients. The list goes on and on, right? So there's a long list of people using that one machine in the hospital every day, and that's just for the brain. You still have people getting abdominal surgery, broken bones, right? So in this space, having an objective measure that can tell you cerebrovascular or structural changes within the brain as a point of care device is huge, because you relieve that burden from the neuroimaging, or not even neuroimaging, the general imaging suite in the hospital, right? And at the same time, you have better outcome for patients because you don't have to move them. A lot of them are intubated, they have drips in their arms, and you don't want to hire a team of 3 people to move them up and down. It's just not safe for the patient. They can get unstable, and you can just get that and compare it to their own baseline longitudinally over time with no radiation as a point of care device, right? So we really feel like this could have big benefits, especially in neurocritical care wards and patients with stroke, TBI, et cetera.
That's great. Thank you, Shane.
Can you comment on the relative price points of where you're going to be coming in at versus kind of standard of care today, and just the differences there?
Yeah, definitely. So it's going to be a lot less. I can say for sure. That's something that we've been trying to pinpoint a number that we're holding off from saying the number just yet for a few reasons. I've talked to quite a few CFOs at hospitals that look at their numbers from stroke, and I've gotten a huge range of, over 100,000. They're saying we could sell the system for, based on the conversations of cost savings that we're having, to some saying you should go a lot lower. And we're trying to optimize that at the moment. So we're not saying a number just yet. But I can tell you that it is going to be the lowest cost form of neuroimaging that will be on the market.
It's super exciting. When you just think about where all these devices could be, at the price points that confidentially I know we've talked about. It's like it can totally revolutionize just how we even think about, addressing this topic. So
yeah, absolutely. And also, it's not something that it's just super confidential. It's more so that I like to just speak accurately. And so, when we do some of these upcoming studies, we're going to learn a lot. And I think that that's really going to, start to fine tune the range of numbers that we have in our head, as well as solidify the business model. And we also have a lot more conversations upcoming that are really going to hone that in. But again, I can tell you that it's going to be incredibly low cost.
And just to give a little hint, when I was doing my PhD in building this handheld device, it cost me about $80 to $100 to make. So I'll just leave that there, knowing that the technology to actually make this is not super expensive. Obviously, automating it brings the price point up a little bit more, but when you do it at scale, it's not going to be crazy. So really, we can come in with an affordable price and make this widely available.
Yeah, and also, this is a technology that we can see becoming a platform, right? So there are a lot of companies out there right now that are interested in the continuity and establishing the continuation of care in terms of presenting all the information together. There are a lot of companies in the stroke space trying to do that, but they're all on the software side. So there is really a big play here where we are collecting objective data across the continuum of the stroke care model. And one of the big problems, and one of the reasons why these companies exist, is because information gets dropped in each transition of care, from ambulance to ED to inpatient to neuro rehab to nursing. It all gets lost. And then all these patients get readmitted because they re-stroke all the time. So there are a lot of companies trying to establish and assist the continuum of care. And I think this is another major angle for us that we're starting to identify, is that we are providing objective data along that continuum of care that's going to be incredibly valuable.
Have any other additional questions?
If we can spill over for maybe a second or a minute, maybe one of you could just weigh in on the potential, intersection with digital health and remote health.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we just published a paper talking about the stroke care in low income and low resource countries. And believe it or not, there are countries that you don't get your brain imaged for 28 days after symptom onset, which you can do the math on the millions of neurons it's usually a cold image at that point, meaning patient is expired. So there's a lot of potential for us in terms of global access to care. And even in the United States alone, there are so many people that live in rural communities that have absolutely zero way of getting to neuroimaging in time. The TPA window is 4.5 hours. The TPA is the drug that you use to dissolve the clot in ischemic stroke. You can't give it after 4.5 hours. And there are people that are that far away in our own country that just miss the window, right? And a lot of countries, actually, what they do, not in the United States, this hasn't happened, but some countries, standard of care is, if they have suspected stroke, you just give them thrombolytics right away, right? And so any patient with hemorrhagic stroke that you give a thrombolytic, it's not good. So, in terms of increasing accessibility to care abroad as well as here, it's going to be huge for us. We're actually exploring that right now with actually a grant opportunity. But in addition, in terms of digital health, like I was mentioning before, this really is, I see this as being a platform technology. This is going to be interfacing with EMRs, and it's going to be interfacing, the data is presented onto a tablet that's saved. This is something that's down the line. There's some problems we'd have to figure out, but I think it's a no-brainer in the stroke care continuum, right? Because like I said before, you lose so much information along the line that if we can have, improve that conversation and that communication of what's happening in the patient's brain at each of those points in time, care will be improved, regardless of just the input and accelerating care from us, but increasing the communication, care will be improved, right?
And
so,
thank you, Dr. Raja Gopal, for your experience in the Philippines. That's exactly the impact and difference that we hope to make. And we hope that everyone can stay tuned as we, iron out all the details and hopefully bring this thing to market next year, as soon as next year.
Yeah, I feel for you for having to make that decision. That's a tough one, because 80% it's ischemic, but 20% of the time it's not, right? And if you give them thrombolytic, it's tough. But I hope the choice was favorable, and this is exactly what we're trying to improve. And again, like Shane mentioned, this is going to be the lowest cost form of helping you augment that individual's care.
Yep. Well, we could go on, but to be respectful of people's time, I think it's probably time to wrap it up. But thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to give us and our audience a deeper dive into what you guys are doing. And yeah, just really looking forward to seeing this into the market. A short 2 years after we invested, which is, as Kevin mentioned, is just baffling. So we're always learning new things as you guys keep pushing forward. So thanks for that, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Take care.
Thank you, Brent. Appreciate it.
Bye.